The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above Washington Park, but Hannah Clarke wasn't under them. She sat on a bench facing the jogging trail, her lunch container balanced on her knees, the Denver afternoon warm enough to make the antiseptic smell of her scrubs fade into something almost like normalcy. The park breathed around her, sprinklers ticking in rhythm, oak leaves rustling in the wind that carried the faint scent of cut grass and asphalt. She'd timed this perfectly. 43 minutes. That's how long Cedar Creek Medical's nursing supervisor tolerated her absences before the pagers started chirping. Her hands, when she lifted the fork to her mouth, showed the map of 22 years. Thin scars webbed across her knuckles like fault lines. One ran deep across her right palm, silvered at the edges, a souvenir from a field thoracotomy with a combat knife in a place the official records called training exercise. She'd learned to move them in ways that drew no attention, no tremor, no hesitation, no tell. Just smooth motions. Practiced. Perfect. The kind of hands that had held things together when the world was coming apart. The folded flag sat in the bottom of her locker at the hospital, tucked beneath her spare shoes. She hadn't opened it in 8 months. Didn't need to. She could see every thread of it behind her eyelids, the way the corners had been creased into perfect triangles, the way it smelled like dust and something darker that she refused to name. That flag was why she was sitting on a park bench in Denver instead of doing what she'd trained for. That flag was why she wore scrubs instead of dress whites. A jogger passed at 2:14 p.m. Male, late 50s, military bearing in the set of his shoulders even in running clothes. She registered him the way she registered everything, cadence, breathing pattern, the slight favor of his left leg. Her eye stayed on her lunch. Professional habit. The kind that didn't fade. Then his rhythm broke. It happened at 2:16 p.m. exactly, near the bend in the jogging path where the tree line thickened and the park seemed to fold inward on itself. One moment he was moving. The next moment he was stopping, not slowing, but stopping, like someone had cut the power. His hand went to his chest. Even from 60 feet away, Hannah saw the gesture repeat itself twice, hard, as if he was pushing against something inside his own ribs that was pushing back. She was standing before her brain finished processing the decision. The lunch container fell to the grass. Her scrubs were forest green, the color of camouflage if you didn't look too close, but she moved like someone who'd never learned how to hide. The man was on the ground by the time her boots hit the jogging path. Collapsed onto his right side, chest heaving in the wrong pattern, not the rhythm of exertion, but the ragged gasp of something electrical going wrong inside the machinery. His face was weathered leather, lined the way faces got when they'd spent years in places where the sun was a weapon. His eyes found hers for exactly 1 second, and in that second she knew him. Commander Richard Voss. Coast Guard. Kandahar Deployment, 2021. The man who'd led her son's unit through the Sanjan Valley when her son was still alive enough to be led anywhere. "I'm a nurse," she said, the words coming out steady, clinical, the voice she used when triage needed doing. "I'm going to check your airway. Don't try to talk." His breathing was shallow. Rapid. O2 sat probably somewhere around 88 to 92, though she didn't have a pulse ox. She could read his skin color instead, the grayish tint spreading like watercolor across his temples, the pale moon of his lips. She knelt beside him, her hands moving through the assessment with the same fluid precision that had kept her alive in places where mistakes didn't leave room for second attempts. Carotid pulse, present but climbing toward panic rhythm. Pupils blown but reactive. No visible trauma. "Chest pain," she said. Not a question. "How long?" "Started." His voice was like something grinding. 2 minutes. "Running." "Felt like." "Keep still." The bench was 30 feet behind her. Her phone was in her locker. The nearest call box was near the park entrance, probably 90 seconds at a run. She didn't run. Instead, she flagged down the first person she saw, a woman with a stroller, mouth already forming the shape of concern, and spoke for words with the kind of authority that made people move without thinking. "Call 911. Say cardiac event. Then she turned back to Voss and did what she'd done in a dozen places where there were no ambulances, no monitored beds, no safety nets. She became the safety net. I need your left arm, she said. Can you move it? He lifted it, trembling. Not fear. Hypoxia. The oxygen his brain was demanding wasn't getting there fast enough. She positioned him on his back, a folded jacket beneath his head, and began the careful work of reading the machine of his body for the specific failure that was happening inside it. Her fingers found the pulse points, strong but irregular, skipping in the way that meant something electrical was misfiring, some wire in the beautiful, terrible complexity of the human heart deciding to rewrite the rhythm. Nitroglycerine, she asked. He shook his head. The tremor spread wider through his limbs now, the body's panic response. Aspirin? Another shake. The woman with the stroller was shouting something into her phone. Good. Hannah's hands moved over Voss's ribs, checking the expansion pattern, the equality of breath sounds against the ambient noise of the park. The sprinklers. The distant traffic on Evans Avenue. The labored rasp of a man whose body was deciding to fail him in broad daylight with a stranger's hands the only thing between him and the park's quiet grass. You're going to be fine, Hannah said. It wasn't a promise she had any right to make, but it was the truth she was going to enforce with every piece of training and muscle memory and grim determination she'd accumulated over 2 decades of not letting people die on her watch. Ambulance is coming. 3 minutes, probably. His eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, something flickered there, recognition, maybe, or just the primal gratitude of a drowning man seeing air. Then his body seized, and she was back in the work, in the space where everything else fell away and there was only the patient, the problem, and the narrow margin between intervention and catastrophe. That's when she noticed the man approaching from the edge of the park. He moved with the careful precision of someone used to being deferred to, his khaki uniform catching the afternoon light, his name tag reading Kern with the kind of prominence that suggested he expected people to read it from a distance. Gerald Kern, Parks and Recreation Department, his stride not quite rapid but deliberate, his expression moving through concern to something else, something that looked almost like calculation. Is someone handling this? He called out. Not a question. A territorial assertion. Hannah didn't look up. Ambulance is 2 minutes out. Patient is in acute cardiac distress. Step back, please. She'd meant it as neutral. Professional. The kind of request that shouldn't register as anything except polite boundary setting. But she watched Kern's jaw tighten at the please, at the implication that she'd given him an instruction wrapped in courtesy. He pulled out his phone. We have a private medical service for city emergencies. More efficient. They can be here faster. He's in critical condition, Hannah said. Her hands never stopped moving. She was monitoring Voss's breathing depth now, the rise and fall of his rib cage, searching for the subtle shift that would tell her his body was starting to give up. 911 ambulance is appropriate. I'll make the call. He was already dialing. Hannah's peripheral vision caught the motion, registered it, filed it away in that part of her brain that never stopped noting details. In another context, she might have found the gesture almost comical, a bureaucrat trying to manage a medical emergency with the same instincts he probably used to manage park permit requests. But Voss's heart was misfiring in a way that suggested time was moving in only one direction now. The ambulance arrived at 2:23 p.m. She heard it before she saw it, sirens cutting through the park's afternoon peace like a knife through canvas. The paramedics emerged with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this 300 times. Hannah brought them up to speed in a language they understood, the numbers and observations that painted the clinical picture: acute onset cardiac event approximately 9 minutes ago, no prior history that I'm aware of, patient responsive but hypoxic, heart rate 142 and irregular, respiration rapid and shallow, no obvious trauma, no medication on scene. They got Voss onto the stretcher with the smooth coordination of a practiced crew, and Hannah stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides, the work finished. The flag in her locker had stopped mattering for exactly 9 minutes. Now it mattered again. She watched them load him into the back of the ambulance, listened to the siren start their retreat towards Cedar Creek, and turned to find Kern still there, his phone still in his hand, his expression the color of something that had just been denied. "I had a private service standing by," he said. "You cost them a dispatch. You cost us a service agreement." Hannah met his eyes with the same steady gaze she'd used with Voss. "I cost you money. It wasn't a question either." And for just a moment, she watched him understand that she'd said it exactly on purpose. The staff meeting started at 7:13 a.m., and Hannah was running the numbers on a pediatric sepsis protocol when Gerald Kern walked through the conference room doors. He moved like a man who owned the space, shoulders back, eyes scanning the room the way a predator scans a watering hole. 14 people sat around the table. 12 of them looked away. Kern didn't sit down. He stood at the head of the table, papers in one hand, the other hand resting on the back of an empty chair. His smile was polished, rehearsed. The kind of smile that preceded something sharp. "We have a situation," he said, his voice modulated for maximum audience awareness. "A situation that needs addressing in front of this team." Hannah kept her eyes on her notes. She knew. The way the air pressure had shifted when he entered, the way no one had made eye contact, she knew this was about Washington Park, about Commander Voss, about the 47 minutes she'd spent stabilizing a man in a Coast Guard uniform while Kern's ambulance company lost thousands in revenue. "Captain Hannah Clarke." He said her name like it was a brand, something distasteful. "Our visiting nurse from the clinic. Our guest." The emphasis on guests made it clear. She wasn't one of them. She was an intruder. Yesterday, there was a medical emergency in the park. A civilian required assistance. He paused, letting that lie settle. Voss had been in uniform. Voss was military. But Kern knew the distinction between a lie of omission and outright deception. And Ms. Clarke here decided that proper protocol didn't apply to her. No one spoke. The ventilation system hummed its mechanical rhythm overhead. Hannah could smell the coffee from the break room, burnt, acidic, hours old. She called 911. She performed an authorized assessment. She gave orders to bystanders. Each accusation landed like a measured hammer strike. All without proper city authorization. All without consulting my office. Hannah turned a page in her notebook. The paper made a sound like wind through dead leaves. "We have clear procedures for park emergencies," Kern continued. "I establish which emergency services are contacted based on incident severity and available resources. It's called resource management. It's called protocol. It's called doing your job properly instead of playing hero on a public bench." The phrase landed exactly where he'd aimed it. Playing hero. As if what she'd done was performance art instead of medicine. As if saving a man's life was about ego. "Going forward," he said, and now his voice dropped lower, making people lean in to hear him, "all park medical interventions will be coordinated through this office. No exceptions. No lone wolves. No unauthorized procedures." His eyes found Hannah's. "Understood." She didn't answer. There was nothing to answer to. The meeting continued for another 18 minutes. Kern discussed seasonal staffing, reviewed budget allocations, made a joke about the new wellness initiative that didn't quite land. Hannah's presence had done its work. The message was sent. She was reminded of her place, of her powerlessness, of the weight of authority that could crush her with a phone call. At 8:53 a.m., the meeting ended. People gathered their papers, checked their phones. Hannah stayed seated, organizing her notes with methodical precision. She could feel eyes on her, quick glances, the kind people make when they're deciding whether to approach or avoid. She was alone in the conference room when she heard the footsteps. 2 of them. Heavy, deliberate. Security guards. Not there to escort anyone out, but clearly positioned to make a point if needed. Kern reappeared in the doorway, this time with a different posture. More casual. More dangerous. Like a man who'd already won and was just enjoying the victory lap. You know what gets me, he said. His voice carried the false warmth of someone talking to a colleague instead of an adversary. You seem like a capable person. Good hands. Quick thinking. But you don't understand chain of command. Hannah stood. Her movements were economical, controlled. Not rushed. Not defensive. I understand chain of command, she said. Her voice was steady. Measured. 8 words, each one placed like a chess piece. I also understand saving lives. The silence that followed was the kind you could operate in. Kern's expression shifted. His mouth tightened at the corners. He'd expected deference, and instead he'd received a statement of fact. It was a miscalculation on his part, underestimating the steel in her spine. Playing hero might work on television, he said, and his tone had changed. Sharper now. Less rehearsed. But here, you follow MY protocols. My authority. My procedures. This is my city, Ms. Clarke. And I don't tolerate freelancers. Commander Voss is alive, Hannah said, her voice not rising, not wavering. Because I followed the protocol that matters. The one that saves lives. It was exactly the right response. Not defensive. Not angry. Not emotional. Just fact. Just the weight of truth. Kern's jaw tightened. She'd held the line, and he could see it. His authority had been questioned in front of his own staff, and she'd answered with something he couldn't contradict, couldn't spin, couldn't make disappear with a phone call. He stepped closer. The security guards remained in the doorway, waiting for direction that might never come. Here's what's going to happen, Kern said quietly. You're going to stay in your lane. You're going to follow procedure. You're going to understand that without my permission, you don't function in this city. And if I ever find out you've overstepped again. He paused, letting the threat breathe. I'll have security escort you from every city facility. Including the clinic. You'll be done. Finished. Hannah met his eyes. One measured breath. She could see the rage underneath his composure, the frustration of a man used to compliance, used to obedience, used to having his will accepted without question. She could see that she'd broken something in his understanding of how the world worked. She didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that would matter. Kern turned and walked out, the security guards parting to let him pass. Hannah remained standing in the conference room, surrounded by abandoned coffee cups and the fading smell of burnt coffee and authority. She opened her bag. Pulled out the folded flag. It was small, maybe 4 inches across, folded into the tight triangle that honor guards create at funerals. The fabric was worn at the edges, handled, carried, held through 1,000 moments of grief. It had been given to her 3 years ago by a Marine named Ortega, whose unit operated with Commander Voss's leadership in Kandahar. Ortega had given it to her with words she couldn't quite remember, something about her son, something about how Voss had tried, they all had, and sometimes trying wasn't enough. She'd taken this assignment, this hidden assignment, this Coast Guard operation buried so deep that even Cedar Creek Medical didn't know what she actually was, because of this flag. Because Voss was still alive, still valuable, still a target. And because the people who'd trained her, the people in the Pentagon who'd approved this cover identity, believed that someone wanted to make sure Commander Voss never stayed that way. She clutched the flag for exactly 6 seconds. The room didn't get quieter. The world didn't slow down. There was no dramatic moment of resolution or strength. There was just a woman in scrubs, holding a piece of fabric that represented everything she'd lost and everything she'd been chosen to protect. She slipped it back into her bag and walked toward the break room. The staff were gathered around the vending machine, talking in the kind of whispers that stopped when you entered a space. Hannah got her coffee, black, nothing added, and walked past them without acknowledgement. One of the newer nurses, a guy named Derek, nodded at her as she passed. She nodded back. That was all they had. A nod. An understanding. No words, because words were dangerous and words had limits. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Kern didn't know what he was actually interfering with. He didn't know that the woman he'd just threatened wasn't a nurse who'd overstepped, she was a captain in the United States Coast Guard. She didn't know that his kickback scheme, his threats, his power plays, none of it mattered compared to the operation she was running. And in exactly 47 hours, it would all come apart. His authority. His leverage. His entire understanding of how much power he actually held. But Hannah wasn't thinking about that yet. She was thinking about Commander Voss, about whether he'd been contacted, about whether the threat Kern represented was as minor as it seemed or if it was the first crack in a much larger wall. She drank her coffee at 9:23 a.m. and waited for the night shift to begin. The park bench where it all began was the same bench where it nearly ended. 2 weeks had passed since Hannah folded Commander Voss's shirt and walked back to Cedar Creek Medical with her scrubs tucked under her arm like a secret. 2 weeks of watching the clinic staff treat her differently, careful distance, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, Dr. Pierce's shadow lengthening across the staff schedules as he waited for her to slip up. She had been waiting for the other shoe. It dropped at 2:33 p.m. on a Tuesday. The call came through dispatch. A jogger collapsed near the maple grove on the eastern edge of Washington Park, approximately 300 yards from the main trail. Breathlessness. Chest tightness. Altered consciousness. Cedar Creek Medical was the nearest facility, response time 7 minutes. Hannah was doing wound assessments in the clinic's community health wing when she heard the sirens start their wail across the city. She didn't move. Didn't look up from the diabetic foot ulcer she was measuring with a ruler calibrated to millimeters. But her hands went still. The sirens meant triage. Meant decisions. Meant someone had crossed the threshold between managing and dying. Dr. Pierce was in his office. She could hear him on the phone, voice tight, negotiating something about billing codes and authorization levels. He hung up with a sharp click. Then, as if he'd sensed the shift in the room's air pressure, he appeared in the doorway wearing his white coat like armor. "We're covered," he said to no one and everyone. "The jogger goes to Mercy General, not Cedar Creek. Direct them now." Hannah kept her eyes on the wound. The edges were macerated, the surrounding skin inflamed. Cellulitis spreading toward the lateral malleolus. This patient needed for antibiotics and vascular imaging. She noted the measurements in the chart with a steady hand. The jogger never made it to Mercy General. By the time Hannah reached the park, because she did reach the park, because responding to emergencies was what her cover demanded and what her training screamed to do, the ambulance was already pulling away, lights off, moving at civilian speed. But the jogger was still there. Chest heaving. One hand clawing at the air like she was drowning in atmosphere. Her name was Sarah Chen, 34, marathon runner, and something was catastrophically wrong with her right lung. Hannah knew the look. She'd seen it in the Helmand Valley when IED shrapnel pierced chest cavities and lungs collapsed inward, the body's most delicate chambers crushed by pressure differentials and physics. Tension pneumothorax. The heart was being compressed. Every breath was becoming harder. Every second was borrowed time. Step back. Dr. Pierce was there, sudden as a curse, his face flushed the color of a bad wound. Stand down, Ms. Clarke. We have protocols. Protocols don't treat pneumothorax, Hannah said. Her voice had dropped. She hadn't planned that. Her knees were already bending, already pulling her med kit from where it hung at her hip, a small olive-drab pouch she'd carried for 8 years, since her last deployment ended and her second one began. She's going into cardiac tamponade. We have maybe 90 seconds. You're a clinic nurse. Not an emergency physician. Hannah's hands were already moving. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from having already survived the worst that physics and human malice could devise. Muscle memory took over. Her fingers found the landmarks on Sarah's chest, felt the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the precise geography of emergency. 14-gauge angiocath. She spoke to the 2 park maintenance workers who'd called 911, ignoring Dr. Pierce's sputtering protests. Either of you got one? In the first aid kit by the pavilion, one said. Go. He ran. Sarah's oxygen saturation was dropping. Hannah could see it in the grey creeping into her lips, the way her pupils were dilating as her brain screamed for oxygen it wasn't receiving. 68%. She'd seen this before. The year was 2011. The location was a medevac platform outside Kandahar airfield. A Marine named Jacobson had taken shrapnel through the chest cavity. His lung was collapsing. His heart was being crushed. Come on, Sarah, Hannah whispered. Stay with me. The needle arrived. Hannah's hands moved like they'd never stopped moving, like the last 13 years of being a nurse in Denver was just a pause in a story that had always been written in her muscle and bone. The needle went in at 90 degrees. The hiss of air escaping, that sound. She would never forget that sound. That sound meant pressure equalizing. That sound meant a body getting a second chance. What are you doing? Dr. Pierce was backing away, his phone already in his hand. You're committing a felony. You're practicing medicine without a license. Hannah watched Sarah's chest expand. Watched the desperate gasping ease into something resembling breath. 72%. 75%. The numbers climbing. O2 saturation improving, she said to the park workers. Keep her upright. Don't move her. The ambulance is 2 minutes out. You're finished, Dr. Pierce hissed. I'm calling security. I'm calling the board. I'm calling the state medical board and the police. You just demonstrated that you have no idea what your boundaries are. Hannah was listening to Sarah's lungs. The one on the right was opening. Air moving freely. 79%. 82%. The panic in Sarah's eyes was fading. That space between gasping and breathing was narrowing. The other ambulance, Hannah said quietly to the park workers. The one you called from dispatch. Don't let them take her. Ask them to wait for Cedar Creek Medical. Tell them we have a pneumothorax needle decompression in progress. You can't give orders. Watch me. 88%. 91%. The heart rate settling from the 140s into something a human body could survive. Sarah's hand found Hannah's wrist. Squeezed. A person saying thank you without words because breathing was taking all the energy she had. The ambulance from Cedar Creek pulled in 3 minutes later, and Hannah briefed the paramedic with clinical precision, handing over the patient and the story in the language of medicine. Secondary spontaneous pneumothorax, right side. Needle decompression performed at 14-gauge angiocath, mid-clavicular line, second intercostal space. Saturation 92% and stable. Heart rate 88. Breath sounds bilateral now. She needs imaging and possible chest tube, but she's breathing. The paramedic didn't ask questions. She just looked at Hannah's hands and the way she stood, like someone who'd done this before, and nodded. Got her. Cedar Creek. Cedar Creek, Hannah confirmed. Dr. Pierce was already on his phone when the ambulance pulled away. Hannah watched him pace near the pavilion, watched his mouth move, watched the way his free hand was balled into a fist. He was calling someone. Multiple someones. Making promises or threats or both. Activating whatever network he'd spent years constructing, board members who owed him favors, administrators who depended on his budget recommendations, consultants and contractors whose contracts depended on his say-so. The park was emptying. The maintenance workers were dispersing. The spectators who'd gathered were already moving back to their routines, their jogs, their lives where people didn't collapse and die on Tuesday afternoons. Hannah stood on the grass with the September sun cutting through the trees, and she thought about something her son had written in his last email, the one that came 3 days before the notification that changed everything. My CO is the kind of guy who makes you believe you'll make it home. Commander Voss had made that promise to her son. Had made it to 43 other Marines in that unit. 37 had kept the promise by not dying. 7 hadn't made it back. And now, because Hannah had saved the commander's life in a park, and because she'd just saved a stranger's life in the same park, someone was working very hard to ensure that her own mission, the reason she was here, the reason she'd left everything behind to be a nurse in Denver, was going to be destroyed before she could finish it. Gerald Kern's hands moved across his desk phone with the precision of someone who'd made these calls 1,000 times. The clinic board chair picked up on the second ring, a woman named Patricia Vance who'd received 2 generous donations to her daughter's charter school foundation courtesy of Kern's recommendations. "Patricia, we have a problem at Cedar Creek." One of the nurses. "Hannah Clarke." He let the name sit there like bait. "She's been operating outside her scope, performing procedures without authorization. We need to protect the clinic's liability." What he didn't say, she'd just cost him $47,000 in ambulance referral fees by saving that jogger herself instead of letting the private company bill for transport. The city councilman came next. Derek Holloway. Kern had funded his last 2 campaigns, $18,000 in legal contributions funneled through vendors who owed him favors. "Derek, I need a favor. There's a nurse creating liability issues. I'm having her terminated, but I need the city attorney's office to open an investigation into her credentials. Make it official. Make it hurt." Holloway didn't ask questions. That was the arrangement. Kern hung up and dialed the clinic's board member in charge of credentialing, a surgeon named Thomas Bennett who'd been referring all his complex cases to the private ambulance company's affiliated trauma center for 3 years. "We need to pull Hannah Clarke's file. Fabricate concerns about her nursing license. Cite inadequate supervision during high-risk situations. Get it documented today." By 2:41 p.m. that same afternoon, the clinic's HR director was waiting outside Hannah's treatment room with a manila folder and her expression like someone holding a grenade. "We need you in my office. Now." "No, please." "No context." Hannah finished cleaning her equipment, a systematic, methodical process she'd performed thousands of times, and followed. The office smelled of stale coffee and the particular kind of institutional anxiety that precedes terminations. The city attorney's investigator arrived at 3:13 p.m. A man named Mitchell who'd never set foot in Cedar Creek Medical before but carried the kind of bureaucratic authority that made people nervous. He had questions. Did she have proper supervision? Was she credentialed for emergency procedures? Why had she taken it upon herself to perform interventions outside standard hospital protocol? The questions weren't really questions. They were accusations shaped like inquiries. Hannah answered each one with the same measured composure she'd learned in combat medical training, minimal words, maximum clarity. Yes. No. Because the patient was dying. She didn't mention that her supervisor was in the ER laughing at medical journals when the jogger came through the doors barely breathing. The HR director took notes. Mitchell took notes. The clinic's legal counsel, a woman named Susan who looked genuinely uncomfortable with this whole affair, sat in the corner trying not to make eye contact. By 4:22 p.m., the investigation was officially open. By 6:58 p.m., it was officially closed. Hannah Clarke was terminated for gross negligence, operating outside her scope of practice, and failing to follow the chain of command. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Her badge, laminated, with her photograph from 6 months ago when she was still someone the hospital trusted, was collected and scanned as surrendered. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She nodded once and asked if she could clear her locker. The employee locker room was empty at 7:16 p.m. Most of the day shift had left hours ago. The night shift was already scattered across the hospital in treatment bays and operating rooms where things actually mattered. Hannah spun the combination lock on her locker, 16:34:8, and opened the metal door to the small universe she'd inhabited for 18 months. A sweater. A thermal water bottle. A spare pair of compression socks. Her clinic polo shirt, navy blue with the Cedar Creek Medical logo over the left breast, hung on a hook. She pulled it down slowly, deliberately, and began to fold it. The fabric was soft from 100 washings. The logo had started to fade where her stethoscope rubbed against it during shifts. She folded it once lengthwise. Then again. Then into a rectangle small enough to fit in her palm. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed, a sound she'd stopped noticing weeks ago but now seemed to be the only thing in the entire hospital that was real and present and undeniable. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Hannah's shoulders didn't tense. Her breathing didn't change. She continued the mechanical process of putting away her life. The folded polo shirt went into the donation bin on the bottom shelf of the locker room, destined for some charity program or medical school student who needed scrubs and didn't yet understand that hospitals were places where good intentions died under the weight of profit margins and institutional cowardice. She closed the locker. Spun the lock. Didn't look back. The rain hit the parking lot like artillery fire. 6 minutes past 8 o'clock, and Denver had decided to prove that autumn storms didn't negotiate. Hannah sat on a bus stop bench 3 blocks from Cedar Creek Medical, her bag, containing a change of clothes, her wallet with $322, and a folded flag wrapped in tissue paper, sitting beside her like a witness to her complete failure. The rain soaked through her jacket. She didn't move. The bench was metal and cold. Her phone had no messages. No calls. No rescue inbound because nobody knew she needed rescuing. The Pentagon didn't know Kern had destroyed her cover. Her commanding officer didn't know her mission, the reason she'd spent 2 years embedded as a nurse, the reason she'd monitored Commander Voss's jogging route and recorded the names of every person he met with in public, was now compromised beyond repair. She reached into her bag and pulled out the folded flag. The cloth was soft from being handled. It came from the dress uniform of Ensign David Reeves, her son's closest friend, who died under Commander Voss's command in Kandahar 17 months ago. Hannah had been assigned to Cedar Creek Medical specifically to monitor whether Voss was still a viable threat to the command structure, whether he'd been compromised by the foreign operative who'd targeted him after that deployment. She was supposed to stay close. She was supposed to watch. She was supposed to prevent the next loss. And instead, she'd been fired by a bureaucrat who cared more about ambulance kickbacks than national security. The flag trembled in her hands. Not from fear. From something colder than that. From the particular kind of rage that comes when you've sacrificed 18 years of your own life, your marriage, custody of your stepchildren, every normal thing civilians took for granted, and it was all erased in 90 minutes by a man who'd never served anything bigger than his own ambition. She almost threw the flag into the storm. Almost let it disappear into the Denver rain where nobody would find it and nobody would remember why it mattered. She held it instead. Held it until her hands stopped shaking. Held it until the rain stopped hitting her like punishment and started hitting her like something to survive. She was still holding it when she heard it. The sound came from the north, distant but growing closer. Not a siren. Not traffic. A low mechanical roar that built from the horizon like something awakening. Hannah's eyes opened wider. The sound clarified, helicopter rotors cutting through the rain, moving fast, moving with purpose, moving toward a city that had no idea what was coming. The bus shelter rattled. The bench vibrated. And somewhere in the distance, where the rain was heaviest, a Black Hawk descended toward the Cedar Creek Medical Complex like divine intervention arriving precisely at the moment when faith had run completely dry. She stayed on the bench. Waited. Because that's what soldiers do when extraction arrives. They wait. They prepare. They become something other than civilian again. The folded flag went back into her bag. Her shoulders straightened. Her breathing synchronized to something deeper, older, combat-trained. The helicopter didn't land near the parking lot. It landed on the roof of Cedar Creek Medical, rotors screaming against the Denver sky. And then the doors burst open. The emergency council chambers erupted the moment Hannah walked in. Not because she arrived, but because of who arrived with her. The helicopter blades had barely wound down on Cedar Creek's roof when she'd stepped into the stairwell, still in civilian clothes, the folded flag clutched against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Now, 36 hours later, she stood at the back of Denver's City Hall Council room while Gerald Kern demanded to justify his actions to 12 elected officials who'd begun to realize they'd been protecting a man extracting six-figure kickbacks from park emergency services. The protocols exist for a reason, Kern was saying, his voice carrying the desperate edge of someone still believing volume could win an argument. Standards. Procedures. Not rogue individuals deciding when to override city authority based on personal feelings. The chamber doors opened. Commander Richard Voss walked through in full Coast Guard dress uniform. The dress whites caught the overhead lighting like polished bone. His medals, a chest full of them, glinted as he moved toward the microphone with the kind of measured pace that made the air pressure change. No one stopped him. No one would have dared. Kern's voice cut off mid-sentence. Voss reached the microphone. His hands were steady on the podium. "I know her as Nightingale 6, he said quietly. The clarity in his voice, the kind that came from giving orders in gunfire, made the room compress. "She is the reason I'm standing here instead of in an urn." The HR director's tablet clattered to the floor. She'd just received a flag on Hannah's background check. Classified security clearance. Pentagon verification required. The words blinked red on her screen like a warning light. A Marine liaison officer in dress blue stood up from the gallery. He held a citation folder. His voice came across the chamber clear and official, in recognition of extraordinary valor under fire in Kandahar province, performing emergency field thoracotomy with a combat knife while under active enemy engagement. Captain Hannah Clarke of the United States Coast Guard saved 17 lives during Operation Nightingale, sustaining enemy fire to her own position to ensure patient stability. Kern's face had begun to drain of color. He started to interrupt, something about jurisdiction, about procedures, but a two-star admiral walked through the same doors. Dress uniform with shoulder boards that seemed to absorb all the room's authority into themselves. She rendered a perfect salute toward Hannah's position at the back of the chamber. "Captain Clarke," the admiral said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional power. "Bronze Star with valor. Purple Heart. Your record precedes you." A Pentagon representative stepped forward with a single document. Operation Nightingale was an active surveillance assignment on U.S. soil, placed under Coast Guard intelligence protocols. Captain Clarke's nursing position at Cedar Creek Medical was essential to her mission scope. That mission has now been compromised by external interference with classified operational security. She looked directly at Kern. "Interfering with a federal intelligence operation carries federal penalties, Mr. Kern." Kern tried to speak. His mouth opened. Closed. The sweat had started visibly now, beading at his temples. What he didn't realize was that the damage extended beyond the room. Behind the scenes, investigators had been reviewing security footage from Washington Park, the jogging path, the emergency bench where Commander Voss had collapsed, the trail system where Hannah had performed the needle decompression 2 weeks ago. They'd requested the park camera files for their federal review. Those files were supposed to be deleted. The IT administrator who'd restored them was a Navy veteran named Patterson. 12 years in IT systems intelligence before moving to municipal work. He'd noticed the deletion attempt at 2:06 a.m., the timestamp logged in his backup protocols. He'd saved every frame. All 72 hours of security footage. And he'd filed a federal complaint with the CIS before dawn, attaching the evidence of deliberate data destruction by a city official trying to conceal a crime. Patterson was standing in the council chambers now too. Kern saw him. Realized what that meant. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. 6 months later, Hannah sat on a park bench in Washington Park. The same bench where this had all begun. Commander Voss sat beside her, also in civilian clothes now. He'd put in his retirement paperwork the week after the hearing. The folded flag lay between them on the bench, the folds precise and careful, the way only military hands knew how to fold something that mattered. "Your son," Voss said quietly. "David Clarke. He was in my unit." Hannah nodded. One breath. She'd prepared for this moment for 2 years. He died in Kandahar, Voss continued. Not because of anything I did wrong. Because he was good at his job. Because he trusted me. And because the people he was protecting needed protection. Voss paused. The medic that day, the one who kept him stable for 40 minutes while we extracted the rest of the unit, that medic was the reason those 7 Marines survived with him. You're that medic, aren't you? Yes, Hannah said. The word came out steady. I was. And when I found out you were here in Denver, that you were running alone 3 times a week down that path. She stopped. Started again. I needed to make sure nothing happened to the man who taught him how to lead people home. Even if it had to be from the shadows. Voss picked up the folded flag. Held it like he understood exactly what it cost her to carry it. 3 blocks away, Gerald Kern was loading boxes into a medical supply van. 40 hours a week of court-ordered community service. The boxes contained bandages, ointment, gauze, the inventory of a small clinic. His hands trembled slightly as he moved them. Not from effort. From the weight of understanding what he'd lost. His pension was gone. The federal fraud charges would likely see trial. His name had been removed from every board, every committee, every vestige of institutional authority he'd spent 23 years building. The Denver Parks Department had issued a statement condemning his actions. The private ambulance company had immediately ceased operations and agreed to a 7-figure settlement. But the worst part wasn't the legal consequences. It was that every nurse who passed him in the loading dock looked at him the same way, with the quiet recognition that he'd been found smaller than he actually was. Hannah watched from where she'd just finished her shift at Cedar Creek Medical. Chief of Trauma Operations now, an offer she'd accepted. She'd traded her undercover assignment for something deeper. A position that let her train nurses. That let her institutionalize the protocols that saved lives. That let her build something that would outlast any single operation. The scrubs she was folding into her locker were different from the ones she'd donated in surrender 2 months ago. These felt like armor. Like choice. She buttoned her civilian jacket over the uniform. The captain's rank was still there, stitched under the collar where only she could see it. Where it belonged. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. Restraint against the urge to approach Kern in the parking lot. To let him know exactly who he'd tried to erase. But that wasn't her path anymore. Her fight was here now. In the ER. In the teaching rounds. In the hand she could train to hold lives together. A text came through on her phone. Voss, dinner tomorrow? She typed back one word, yes. Because some wars didn't end with salutes or medals. They ended with a man and a woman, sitting on a bench, finally able to tell the truth about the people they'd both lost and the reasons they'd stayed behind to make sure no one else had to. Subscribe for more stories of the people who serve in silence, the ones whose greatest victories happen when the world stops watching. Like this video if you believe the quietest strength is often the most dangerous. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value?